On today's show, we are going to be breaking down the Minnesota Wild's 2024 draft class as well as their entire prospect pool.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this show, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. I'm Sebastian High, Director of European Scouting over at Dobber Prospects, typically joined by Hattie Kalakash, Director of North American Scouting at Dobber Prospects. And today we've got a very exciting show for you because we're going to be breaking down the prospect pool as well as the 2024 draft class of one of the NHL teams that is the best at drafting and developing young talent in the Minnesota Wild. But before we jump into the episode today, today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, the Minnesota Wild are a fascinating NHL team, in my opinion. I love the way that they approach drafting and developing prospects, and the 2024 draft class was no exception to that rule. They did a great job at getting high-end value out of every single one of their draft slots, and I'm very curious to see how this overall draft class ages and develops in the next couple seasons, because I think there's a lot of upside here and a lot of swings on high-end skill and high-end intelligence, which I have a lot of respect for. So at 12th overall, a pick where they traded up from 13 with the Philadelphia Flyers in order to acquire it, they went out and took the steal of the first round outside the top 10, in my opinion, and that's Zeev Buium, the left shot defenseman from the University of Denver, who dominated the NCAA as a freshman this past year, scoring 50 points, including 11 goals in just 42 games on the road to winning the Frozen Four championship for the University of Denver, and he was the best player on that team in my eyes. He was clearly the best defenseman in that lineup and was leaned on really heavily, far more so than the average freshman is at the NCAA level, especially when they're still just draft eligible. And Buium brings a bunch of things to the game that are super valuable. He's incredibly intelligent. He's really, really slippery. He's able to get out of tight situations with seeming ease. He's a fantastic passer. He's great in the breakout. He's an impactful piece in every single aspect of the game that you could ask him to do things in. And that means in the offensive zone, he's a high-end creator. He's a really good playmaker. He's a really cerebral tactician in the offensive zone, and whether it be in distribution from the point, in activation, and off-puck movement to try to create openings either for himself or his teammates, and just a highly intelligent player who is far more polished than like the average draft eligible is, and he plays the game a lot more like a 22-year-old would than an 18-year-old, which is a massive compliment to his style of play. He's also fantastic defensively. Don't let his 6 foot 185-pound frame fool you. This is a player who, despite just being about an average level skater, is a really, really good transition defender. He's able to keep a really tight gap. He has a high degree of anticipation, and he reads the opponents really, really well. He also is quite good at covering secondary and tertiary threats. He does not get tunnel vision on just what is directly in front of him or just on the puck, and is very adaptable defensively. He's able to make an impact in various ways. He's not the best at clearing the net front, which is not a surprise given his frame, but he's able to out-leverage opponents. He has good leverage mechanics and knows how to use his frame to make those small advantages, especially in the defensive zone, that are really, really valuable, especially for type of defenseman who often has to, at the frame of 6 feet and 185 pounds, those defensemen often have to compensate for their lack of size in various ways. And Buium does so in just about every way that you could want him to. So I think he's going to be a fantastic fit in Minnesota. They clearly value players in this mold. Quite comparable in some ways to Brock Faber. Obviously differences where Faber is probably a bit more of a defensive leaning player. Buium is, at least as the draft eligible, far more of a two-way force and already outproduced Faber in any NCAA season in his career as a freshman. And I'm curious to see how he'll continue to develop there at the University of Denver. But I think this is a player who could be a top pairing defenseman long term. A Faber and Buium pairing would be disgusting at the NHL level. Sure, not the two biggest guys in the world, but highly intelligent, very adaptable. And I think they could build a fantastic amount of chemistry together as a unit. And I cannot wait to see Zeev Buium at the NHL level. I don't think it's going to take all that long because he is so refined. He's so polished. And that degree of intelligence and how that works with the rest of his toolkit is already just so NHL styled in so many ways that I think he'll be an NHLer in 1 or 2 years' time. I do not think it's going to take him particularly long. And I also don't think that staying at the University of Denver for longer than a year from now is going to be particularly useful in developing him. He's already one of the best players in the entire NCAA. Last year, it was Buium and Macklin Celebrini that, for most scouts, myself included, were the two best players in the entire college ranks, and they were both freshmen. There was a lot of quality from the NCAA in this past draft class, and Buium was definitely a front runner in that slot. But he's not the only quality player that Minnesota added. Sure, he's the highlight of the draft class. He has the highest ceiling. I think he's going to be the first player from this draft class by a decent margin to be an impactful NHLer as well. But there's a lot more value here beyond just him. In the second round, they selected Ryder Ritchie at 45th overall, a young player for the draft class, a 6'1", 176-pound right shot right winger who is highly skilled. This is a really, really good puck handler, especially at lower speeds. When he's really going at a full stride, the handling isn't quite as effective, and there are definitely still some questions around this player and his profile, which is why he fell that far in the draft class. Like, for instance, he was playing in a Prince Albert Raiders system where he just didn't have all that much offensive support, and he was asked to be an offensive driver at 5-on-5, which just isn't his game. He is a truly skilled but support piece at his core. He's not going to be the guy that you get the puck and gets the most puck touches among your forward lines, but he does a lot with the puck touches he gets. I think there's still a lot to kind of work with this player, but the upside is really big. I think that the creativity, the offensive intelligence, the ability to break down defensive structures all on his own through his puck handling and his intelligence and his overall playmaking and goal scoring ability as well are very clear areas of strength. And he's a player I cannot wait to see continue to develop there in the WHL. And he's going to need a couple years time for sure to develop into an NHL piece, but there's so much to work with this guy that it's a perfect quintessential Minnesota type of draft pick. He fell further than he should. He has a high level of skill. He's intelligent. He's young. There's a lot of runway in his development. Those are the guys that Minnesota likes to pick in this range of the draft. We've seen it a lot recently, whether it be Riley Heidt last year or various players along those lines. Marat Kusnedinov also comes to mind. They love these types of players, and I think Ryder Ritchie is going to develop very nicely as a member of the Minnesota Wild. Next up in the fourth round, we have another potential steal of the draft class in Aaron Kiviharju, who somehow fell to 122nd overall. He is far from a slam dunk NHLer, which is why he fell. He's undersized. He's not a very good skater, especially considering that he is 5'10", 185 pounds. And the defensive side of the game is a big area of weakness. There's definitely warts in his game, and I wouldn't give his NHL shot a greater than 50% chance. That said, he is an elite level passer. He's a fantastic distributor. He's great in the breakout. He's so shifty under pressure, and he's highly, highly intelligent. The level of composure that kind of just permeates his game is something that stood out to me in every single viewing I've had of him. And he's a guy that I thoroughly believed should have gone in the top 75 at most. So to get him at 122 is fantastic value. And this is also a player who I've talked to some NHL scouts that have interviewed him at the combine and so on. And they've told me that he's been the best interview they've ever had. Incredibly mature. It feels like when they're talking to him, that's not an 18-year-old kid sat across from them, but rather a 25-year-old man and somebody who's just incredibly reflexive and intelligent and really thinks the game, but also the off ice things at a high level, and a player who has these warts in his game, but definitely still a lot of runway in his development. We're going to see what a full healthy season's going to look like for him. Fingers crossed with HIFK in Liga this upcoming year. And I would love to see him play a big role and get some power play minutes and overall be able to showcase the level of skill and intelligence that made him a potential top 5 selection when he was a D-2, when we were looking ahead at the 2024 class back in like 2022. Kiviharu's name was right in the fray there with Macklin Celebrini's, Cole Eiserman's, and Michael Hages of the world. And I think that getting him in this range of the draft is fantastic value. They picked another Finnish defenseman next up in the 5th round at 140th overall in Sebastian Soini. This is a pretty meat and potato style of player. He's a 6'2", 187-pound right shot defenseman who, young for the draft class as well, a June 10th birthday, but a player who struggled a lot this past season. We had a couple of viewings this year that were really iffy, especially in like the U18 World Championship preliminary games, where he was cut from that roster because he struggled that much, despite being a player who played in Liga games this year. He got into 6 games, got a single assist, got 8 assists as well in 32 Mestis games, which is the second tier of pro hockey in Finland. And yeah, I think he's a guy that definitely still has some runway. He's a really good skater. The four-way mobility is a clear area of strength, and he makes a good first pass. There are things to work with for sure here. I personally have a lot of questions, and I don't know if I would have personally drafted him this year, but clearly Minnesota believes in his tools and thinks that there's still a long way to go in his development. So very curious to see how he continues to develop at the Liga level there in Finland. Next, they picked a goaltender in the 5th round at 142nd overall, and that is Chase Wutsky, a 6'2", 161-pound left catching goaltender who was playing with the Red Deer Rebels in the WHL last year. He has a bunch of room to grow, whether it be in terms of filling out his frame. I mean, he's only 161 pounds at this stage. He's also a late July 06 birthday. I'm seeing a trend here with the Minnesota Wild. They like taking players who are young for the draft class and have a lot more like developmental runway than other players that are available in these slots. Wutsky played in 36 games last season. He had a .904 save percentage in the regular season and one-upped himself in the playoffs, where he started 7 games for Red Deer and put up a .924 save percentage. Clearly a player who progressed significantly over the course of the season. He's really mobile, especially when he's down in the butterfly, and has good edge work. There is a decent amount of tools to work with here, and I really like the fact that he's very efficient with his movement. He does not waste his cross crease motions at all. He doesn't overextend either on them. He's very efficient, and I think that there's a decent amount of growing room with this player, and definitely a decent swing to take there late in the draft. With the final selection of their 2024 draft in the 6th round, Minnesota picked at 174th overall Stevie Leskovar from the Mississauga Steelheads in the OHL. An interesting player because he is actually a D+2 player as September 9th, 04 birthday, but he's a 6'4" player, 207-pound left shot defenseman, and he progressed a lot this past season with Mississauga. He's a real defensive stalwart. Don't expect him to be a dynamic offensive presence. Even as a D+2, he only scored 2 goals and 12 points in 61 OHL games this year, but he's definitely a late bloomer. In his draft year season, he only got into 12 OHL games for the Peterborough Petes and went up himself with 52 games as a D+1 and finally 61 games this past season, but a massive type of penalty gatherer with 113 penalty minutes this season. He's physical, he's big, he uses his size and frame and his range to cover a bunch of ice, and overall an intriguing profile to take a swing on. He hadn't been on my personal radar, but at the NHL draft with late round selections, you rarely have all that much overlap of who is on whose radar because there's so many different options that are very much in similar tiers of being potential bottom of the lineup NHLers at the peak of their development. But I think as a whole, this was a strong draft class for Minnesota. There's a lot to like here, a lot of quality. I'd give it an overall A- grade, which is very much lifted by the elite upside of Zeev Buium, but a lot of other pieces here that are really valuable. And overall, I think they did very well, which is par for the course for Minnesota at this stage because they consistently do just draft very well. But that wraps up this first segment. In the next one, we're going to dig into the overall prospect pool for the Minnesota Wild and look at some of the big standouts. And there is a lot to look forward to in that range. But first, a quick message from our sponsors. If you want last-minute tickets, Game Time is the place to be. With Game Time, you can get awesome last-minute deals where you can save up to 60% on whatever event you are interested in attending, whether it's a sporting event, whether it's a concert, a comedy show, whatever it is that you are interested in, Game Time has you covered. Game Time also offers awesome zone deals where you pick the zone or the section and Game Time selects the seat for you for added potential savings, especially if you have a really tight schedule and something opens up for you last minute where you have some time to go out and do something fun to treat yourself to an event. Game Time is exactly what you need. Game Time also gives you a lowest price guarantee. If you find a better price than what is listed on Game Time, just have to show that receipt to Game Time and you will get 110% of the difference in order to go with Game Time to your event. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply, but again, use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, let's keep this episode going here. And the overall prospect pool for Minnesota is really intriguing. We're going to go here position by position, starting off with the forwards, moving on to the defense core, and finishing off with the goaltenders. Then we're going to look a little bit into what areas of need there still might be in this prospect pool. And a quick hint, we're just going to be a bit nitpicky there because there aren't massive areas of weakness in this pool. But let's start off here with the forwards. And there's a couple names here that I want to highlight right away. First and foremost, Danila Yurov, a player who has developed fantastically since being drafted in the first round just about 2 years ago by the Minnesota Wild. And he had a fantastic year in the KHL this past year. He scored just under 50 points in just over 60 games at the KHL level while also being a high-end defensive player. His two-way game has always been a big area of strength for Yurov, and he's been definitely showing why he was projected as a top 10 pick for much of his draft year season, which was hampered by a complete lack of playing time because he was just playing like 10 seconds a game in the KHL for most of that year. But he has definitely progressed massively. His two-way game is fantastic. The defensive awareness, the defensive habits, the ability to apply pressure at the right time and not overextend and get himself out of play is also really refined already. He's a guy that has a really high floor as a middle six winger who can do a bunch of everything, whether it be helping out in the defensive zone, being a real transition helper. He's a really good skater. He's a good puck carrier. He's a really good passer. He's a good shot. He is a very well-rounded player, but the high-end brain and the high-end defensive impact very much elevate his overall projection, and he's a player that could very much become a top six stalwart for a very, very long time in Minnesota. He's probably still going to need another year to develop into an NHL like regular, but definitely on the right track. Liam Ergren is in a kind of similar position in my eyes. Also, high-end defensive player. He's also a winger, but has a wicked shot offensively. He's really physical. He's mean, but gritty, and he gets to the dirty areas. Doesn't go for massive hits or anything, but he's very intelligent in how he leverages his physical play. He's already gotten into a couple NHL games and looked decent in those, and I think there's a lot of growing room for Ergren. I don't think he's going to be a first-line player when he finishes his development. That's probably the one area of weakness in this pool is the lack of top-line projection players. But that said, he's a really intelligent, really refined, and polished player that I think is going to be a top 9 guy in Minnesota as of this season, perhaps. Similar thing can be said about Murat Kuznetsov. Already gotten into 16 NHL games, played very well in those. Super speedy, super intelligent. He's a centerman. A lot to like with him, whether it be in the defensive zone or as a playmaker offensively. Hunter Haight is another really good playmaking center. They really like their playmakers there in Minnesota, and players that are also very adaptable and also being able to score goals, but do so in intelligent ways rather than just leveraging like a booming elite level shot, which they don't really have massively in this pool, but they don't really need it, in my opinion, especially with Kirill Kaprizov, who's going to be sticking around for quite a while there in Minnesota too. Riley Height, the other Height, is also an intriguing prospect here. He has a good power play shot. He's a really good power play type of forward, and he took a big step in his development as a D+1 after being drafted in the second round a year ago. Really skilled, really good skater. Still some defensive warts in his game too, but a lot to work on, and I think that he could be a second line guy when he really hits his peak in his development. But we're going to see how that keeps progressing. One forward I have some more questions around is Charlie Stramel. He was a first-round pick a year ago, which definitely surprised me a little bit just because it wasn't the strongest draft year season in Wisconsin, and he followed it up with an even weaker D+1 year. We're going to see how he bounces back this upcoming season, but he's a big centerman. He can add a decent amount of playmaking ability as well to the equation, and there were definitely flashes of elite-level playmaking when he was still with the NTDP before making the switch to the NCAA, but the last 2 years of development haven't really gone his way, but again, we'll see how he keeps progressing. He's still just 19 or 20 years old. He still needs some more time to refine his game. Last but not least, we still have Ryder Ritchie, of course, who we've already mentioned, as well as Rasmus Kumpalainen, who played a decent season last year as a D+1 with the Oshawa Generals, but he's going back to Finland this year to play in Liga with Lahti Pelicans. I'd love to see how he fares at the professional level, and I think that he will be a bit more fit for that type of play than in the OHL, and we're going to see how he keeps progressing as well. Now, the defensive core. We have some high-end players here. Zeev Buium, we've already talked about him. Don't need to talk too much more about him here, but fantastic player, potential first pairing guy. Carson Lambos is a defenseman that I also quite like. The level of mobility, the offensive distribution. He has a wicked shot from the point. He's just kind of been chugging along in his development in the background, not in the biggest spotlight, which I think has been really good for his development, which could have been different if he'd been drafted by teams with less depth in their prospect pools. Jack Perch is also a decent left shot D, who I think is quite mobile and brings a level of upside of like maybe a number 5 defenseman long term. Same can be said about Aaron Kiviharju. He could even maybe be a number 4 guy if he really hits his ceiling, which I would love to see because the way he thinks the game, the way he's able to use his passing ability to just create massive advantages, whether it be in the breakout or offensively, is just really, really fun to watch. And I'd love to see him bounce back from his injury-riddled draft year campaign. The last 2 I want to give shout-outs to here are Ryan Healy and Damon Hunt. 2 more players that are quite well-rounded, really good skaters, and are able to just really bring a lot of versatility to the equation. They aren't bruising defensemen. They're a little bit smaller. That's definitely one quality of this overall defensive core. Minnesota does not believe that size equals skill or size equal like NHL projectable. They go for players that are intelligent and skilled and have a lot of nuance in their games. So I like this approach a lot, but clearly they're also getting some of the bigger defensemen with their later round picks, as we mentioned with Stevie Leskovar in the last segment. In goal, another really, really good player in Jesper Wallstedt, a player that I thought was a top 3 type of prospect in his draft year there in 2020, but fell all the way down past 20 to the Minnesota Wild, and that was a draft pick that they traded up for with the Edmonton Oilers, which I still think stings Oilers fans to this day, but he's a player that could even make a step to become the number 1 goaltender as of this season for Minnesota. There's so much skill in his game. He's so intelligent. He's big, he's mobile, he's athletic, but he's also really calm and composed. He doesn't overextend on sequences, and overall, he is like made to be an NHL goaltender in the way he thinks the game and also the way he's built, and overall, just like quite clearly for me, the most exciting goaltending prospect in the entire NHL right now. So clearly a player that Minnesota is very happy to have in their ranks. And of course, they also have Chase Wutsky, who we talked about in the last segment, who is an interesting goaltending prospect in his own right. In terms of areas of weakness, again, it's a bit nitpicky because it is such a refined and overall balanced prospect pool, in my view. They have players in just about every mold. I think they could add another power forward into the mix that would really help out because the one power forward in their prospect pool, or the two they have at forward would be Liam Ergren, who is probably a power forward, but not the quintessential NHL power forward, and Charlie Stramel, who I still don't know where he figures in long term for the Minnesota Wild with his development stagnating. But apart from that, just adding another high end top line forward, as well as potential like I don't know like top four right shot defensemen. I think those are areas that could still be reinforced a little bit in the prospect pool, but again. It's nitpicky. Minnesota drafts well. They have a balanced organization, and they know their areas of strength and weakness very well, and they continuously address that year in, year out. So overall, I think the prospect pool gets an A grade from me. It is a really strong one, and I think that Minnesota Wild fans should be very excited because they have a pretty good team on the ice already right now, and they have a lot more talent waiting out in the wings that are going to be coming in the next couple seasons. Even this year, we're going to see a lot more young players make the jump, and we'll talk about that as well as the overall 2024-25 season projections for the Minnesota Wild in the final segment. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks to LED headlights, exhaust kits, and far more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what it is that you're looking for with eBay Motors. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, which is available to US customers only, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and take home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. Alrighty, let's wrap up the show here by looking ahead at the following season, next season, which is going to be starting in just over a month or two's time. And there's a lot to be looked forward to if you're a Minnesota Wild fan. I think this is a team that is gearing up to make a real push for the playoffs this season. And there's a lot of young players that could be taking significant steps to really help that goal become a reality. Whether it be Marco Rossi or Matt Boldy really taking significant more steps in their development. I mean, Matt Boldy's already been showing that the last couple seasons that he is a fantastic top line winger. And I think that Marco Rossi is a player who, I mean, already as an NHL rookie, after all the hurdles he had to go through between being drafted and making his NHL debut, was already a half point a game player in his rookie season while playing really good two-way hockey as well. And he's a player that I admire a lot and how he's able to leverage every tool he has as an undersized forward to consistently make a difference. He has a massively quick motor. He never stops working. He's a really good playmaker. He has a good shot. He's so intelligent. He's really strong defensively. He brings everything he can to the equation, and he's a very effective NHLer already. And I would love to see him take another step playing top 6 minutes for Minnesota this season. Beyond that, I think a lot is also going to hinge on Brock Faber continuing his play from last season. There's going to potentially be a sophomore slump for him. We're going to see how that develops because the sophomore slump, of course, hits like so many players in the NHL when that like adrenaline of actually making it for the first time wears off a little bit. And on top of that, you add now the massive extension having been signed, the 8-year, $8.5 AAV contract that he signed with Minnesota to lock him up long term that I think is really good value. Honestly, I think he's going to be a player that lives up to that contract at least. And by the time he's in towards the end of that, I think it's going to look really, really good against the salary cap. But if he takes a step back this year, I think the playoff hopes are going to be a little bit more iffy because he was really their number one guy last year. He was playing 25 to 30 minutes a night for the vast majority of last season. He was top 10 in average time on ice in the entire NHL as a rookie. And on top of that, I think that with that heavy workload, I don't know how strong the stamina is going to be to repeat that this year to the same degree, but I'd love for him to do so, and I'm definitely going to keep my eye on him for the entirety of this season. I love the way he plays. I love the mobility. I love the defensive intelligence, the distribution in the offensive zone. He's such a good player. I also think that Liam Ergren, as I mentioned in the last segment, could maybe make a push to get into that top 9 for Minnesota this year, which would also just add and really infuse some more talent and intelligence into that lineup, and also bring some more versatility to the equation. He can play on the penalty kill. He can play on the power play. You can move up and down the lineup. If you have him on the fourth line, I don't think it stagnates his development too much, or you can fill in the top 6 if injuries arise. There's so much that you could do with this player, and I think he's going to be a really useful piece of this team right out of the gate. Beyond that, you also still have Jesper Wallstedt. Is he going to make a big push to become the starting goaltender for Minnesota? My co-host Hattie Kalakesh definitely thinks he will, and even thinks that he's going to be playing like 40 games this season. I think I myself have a few more doubts of just how many games he'll get into this year, but he's definitely getting close to being fully NHL ready. He's been a dominant goaltender at the AHL level, and Marc-Andre Fleury is getting older, and he has been for the last decade, but still a decent NHL goaltender. But I do think we're getting towards the twilight of his time with the Minnesota Wild. And Philip Gustafsson struggled a decent amount last season after a fantastic first campaign with Minnesota following his trade from the Ottawa Senators. But I'd love to see Wallstedt really like take the mantle in net for Minnesota and really carry that team, because I think he could. He's so skilled, as we talked about in the last segment. I also think that he could get around a 9-10 save percentage this season, whether that's in 25 games or 40 games. We're going to see. I think my bet is going to be closer to 25 games, but the 40-game mark is certainly possible as well, and depends a lot as well on if there's any goaltender injuries in the depth chart ahead of him and how he performs in training camp. Beyond that, in terms of young stud projections, I think Brock Faber is going to, in terms of points, get around the same amount that he got last year, around the 45-point mark, maybe 5 goals, 40 assists to get that range of production. Marco Rossi, I think, is going to take a step as well. A 25-goal season, 55 points. Matt Boldy is going to be a fantastic first-line winger, as he's been showing for quite a little while now, and I think he could get close to 40 goals, maybe 35, and maybe 80 points or something around there. But this is going to be a season where Matt Boldy really puts a stamp down as a perennial first-liner in Minnesota. Liam Ergren, I think, could also chip in with 15 goals and 35 points. He's a really intelligent player who, even if his minutes aren't the biggest, I think will still be able to make his way in on the score sheet, because he's a player that I think is just going to excel at the NHL game. He is made for NHL style of hockey, and I cannot wait to see him in a full NHL season. And a similar thing can be said about Marat Kuznetsov. Stylistically very different to Liam Ergren, even though some of the effects are a little bit similar in terms of having a clear offensive strength in his playmaking, as well as a high degree of defensive impact as well. I think that Kuznetsov could get around the 10-goal, 35-point mark this season. As a whole, I think Minnesota is really gearing up for a playoff push this year. I think there's a lot to be excited for if you are a Minnesota Wild fan, and it's not like it's a do or die season either. If you don't make the playoffs, it's not the end of the world. You're still going to get a lot more talent in the doors in a year's time, in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time to really bolster that lineup continuously. And I think that Minnesota is going to be a really good team in the West for a really long time with how they've been being built here. And they are one of my favorite teams as well in the West. I love watching them play. I love the identity of the team and how they play on the ice and how they think the game, how the system is structured. Really, really fun organization that I would love to see make some real damage in the playoffs as soon as this season. But that wraps up this episode, breaking down the Minnesota Wild's prospect pool and their 2024 draft class. My name is Sebastian Hyde, Director of European Scouting over at Dauber Prospects. If you're listening on YouTube, please like, subscribe, leave us a comment with your thoughts. What are your thoughts about Minnesota this season? Which players are you most excited to see? Who do you think is going to perhaps like surprise and be a big impact player maybe not to the same degree that Brock Faber was last year, but along those lines. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. We always appreciate our everydayers. And for your second listen of the day, head on over to Locked On Sports Today, a 24-hour news show breaking down everything that's going on in the sporting world today. But that wraps things up here. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope that you come back very, very soon.